next speaker also works at GitHub. His name is Arthur Neves. He's going to talk about using multiple connections in ActiveRecord. Arthur is from Brazil. He lives in Toronto, Canada. He is core application developer at GitHub. He works remotely. He's a Ruby on Rails contributor and also Ruby Gems contributor. And he loves playing soccer. He makes sure he plays soccer at least 3 times a day. So let's welcome Arthur.
It's working. Yeah, I can see it. Can you all see it there? It's all fine? So hello, everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about multiple connections in ActiveRecord. So this is going to be kind of like a heavy technical talk. I hope you all bear with me. Like if you have questions, you can ask me afterwards, or you can email me or tweet at me. Like we can talk if you have any more questions. So first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Arthur. This is my handle. Arthur, and this is my handle in Twitter, GitHub. This is also my email. So if you want to email, you can arthurnn@github.com. As you can see my slides, I work for GitHub. Those are sponsored slides. And yeah, so I love doing open source. That was a really good talk about open source. I have some opinions about open source as well, but I'm not going to talk about them today. So I am in the Rails community team. I also do like rubygems.org. So like most of the server side of Ruby Gems, that's what I spend a lot of my time. I have a gem, like a memcached gem. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it afterwards. So this is a graph that shows me that I have one more commit than Vipu. So I'm really happy about that, and you all should make fun of him because of it. No, I'm kidding. So the agenda for the talk today, so I'm going to be talking about using multiple connections in ActiveRecord. And I'm going to be talking a little bit how that look before Rails 5, what is new in Rails 5 that makes like using them like easier, and what is the future work that I'm going to be working on Rails 5.1. So I really like this subject because a lot of the connection work in Rails itself, I wrote it, so I kind of like know a lot about it, and I wish like more people knew about it as well so they can contribute to Rails and help me out with these projects I have. So first of all, why, right? Like, why would you want to use multiple connections in ActiveRecord? So first of all, when I'm talking about connections, I'm talking about database connections, just to be clear. And the why here, it's like, I think the main like response for this question is scale, right? Like, so for instance, GitHub, we have I don't know how many requests a second. We have a lot of requests a second. So we need to scale our website to handle all that traffic, right? So that's kind of like what we use as a tool to scale our service, right? Like you have things, like some people tend to go the other way, which is like instead of using like one big application with a lot of connections, what they do, they go microservices. I'm not a big fan of microservices, so I'm definitely not going to talk about that, and I'm not going to say bad things about it as well. But I think the big response for the why would you want to use multiple connections is to reach to a scale. There's also like one interesting point that I want to make in here as well. It's like I think there is kind of like a misconception in Ruby community and also like the other communities that people tend to say like that Ruby is slow, Ruby on Rails is slow. And at least from my experience, yeah, Ruby is not as fast as C, but it's like if you're writing a web app, most of the times you're not bounded by your web application. You're not bounded by Ruby or whatever C or Elixir that you're using. Most of the time, you're actually bounded by the database because that's where your data is. And you're reading and pushing new data to the database all the time. And once your data grows, that's going to become a problem. So like 100% of the problems that I had before that they were related to performance, they were like related to the database. So a few different use cases for using different connections. So those are 3 different use cases. So first one, data partitioning, right? So what is data partitioning? So let's say you're building Twitter, right? Like you just like starting Twitter right now, and after like so in your first months like of that app is online, you probably don't have that many users, but afterwards you're gonna start having a lot of users, and you want to scale that. So in Twitter, if you think about it, you have the main screen, which is the dashboard, which shows all the activities, all the tweets. So if you think how Twitter implements that in the backend, they probably have like one huge table that stores all the tweets, right? But they also have other tables, like user tables and all the connection tables. They have a lot of like other tables as well. But so after if you see it, like you can realize that I think it's kind of fair to say that maybe 80% of the data is in that tweets table, and the other 20% is in the other databases. So if you want to partition, so data partitioning is pretty much like splitting that to a different database, right? So you would have one database that holds that huge table, and another database that holds the other data. So that's one use case. Other use case, it's like a read-only database, right? That's how actually we scale GitHub a lot. So you have, let's say, one primary database, and for instance, in MySQL, right? Like in MySQL, you can have one primary database and you can have multiple read-only databases. So this is really good because now you don't have just one database box. You can have multiple database boxes that you can read from it. But so like that's actually like we use, I don't know how many servers, but like we use a lot of different read-only services at GitHub, and that's how we scale. There's also the third use case, which is sharding. I'm not going to be talking much about sharding. I've did like in the past a few talks about sharding. But like just a summary of sharding. What sharding is, it's pretty much like the first use case, but after you reach to a certain point that table, it's too big to even fit in one database, you can split that table in different databases. So that's what pretty much sharding is. So first of all, how does it work right now, right? Like, I mean right now in Rails before 5. I was just assuming Rails 5 was not released at this point, but it is already released. But anyways, so how does it work before Rails 5? So let's take a look at some code. I hope everyone can see the code. I just changed to white. So here you have a user model, extends ActiveRecord base, and you have a method called establish connection. And that established connection, you pass a user DB, which is just a key in your database YAML. So what you're doing here is you're just like telling ActiveRecord that every time you do any query in that user DB, that should not go to the main database. That should go to the user DB. So this is pretty much what you're accomplishing here is that first use case that I described, which is the data partitioning use case. So that's pretty easy. That's there in Rails like for a while now. I don't know, since I started with Rails, this was there already. So that's cool. The first use case is there. But what is the problem, right? Like the problem, I mean, like how about the second and the third use case, right? How about if that user, now I don't want to use one connection for that user. I want to use multiple connections. Because now I have 10 different read-only databases, and I want to like read from them. So now I need 10 different connections from one user. So the problem about this is that's not possible before Rails 5. So let's take a look at a diagram here. Those are like a few classes that ActiveRecord uses internally to handle the connections. You can see here we have ActiveRecord base, which is like main class, which is the model that you extend. That ActiveRecord base has a connection handler, which is one instance. So your app, it's only going to have one connection handler instance. That's kind of global. And the connection handler has a few hashes here. Like second hash is just for some caching, but the first hash is the important one, which is going to be the honor to pool. So that honor to pool is going to point to multiple connection pools. So in that hash, you're going to have as a value the model name, and as a key, the model name, and the value is going to be the connection pool. So in that example, in the user example, you would have one value here would be like user key and a new connection pool that points to the database that you use for users. So let's take a look at the established connection code, so it's better to visualize that. This is the internal established connection code in the connection handler for ActiveRecord. This is like a pretty simple method. It has like 5 lines. And the main deal in this method, it's in line 4. Right? You can see that this method receives an honor. The honor is the ActiveRecord model. And in line 4, what it does, it just creates a new connection pool using the spec that you pass and using as a key on that the honor name. So that's exactly what I explained, right? Like in that hash for the user scenario, you're going to have like a user as the key and a new connection pool. So another important method in the connection handler, so like you have like 2 kind of important methods in the connection handler, right? You have the one that establishes the connection, and you have the one that retrieves that connection. internally to Rails. So every time you do a query, Rails is going to call this retrieve connection pool internally in the connection handler to find the right connection. So you can see that this method, what it's receiving in line 1, it receives the class. That class is the model, because it needs to receive the class, so it can like figure out what is the name of that class, so it can look up that in the hash. There is some extra code here, like line 3 to 6, which is just like a simple for loop, because Rails always want to fall back to the parent class to find a connection. So for instance, you have another model that you don't call established connection in that model. So in that model, you should use the default connection. So Rails is just going to fall back always to the parent class, to the superclass. So that's like not rocket science. So again, so like what is, going back to the problem, right? Like, so the problem was I cannot have multiple connections for the same model, because if you think about it, that diagram that I showed before, you have one hash, and you cannot have multiple values for the same model. So you cannot have multiple connection pools for the same user. So there is a few solutions out there to do that before Rails 5, which is like install a gem, as everything in Rails. You can like either install one of those gems. I tried DB Charmer before, and at that time I was using Rails 3.2 and it worked fine. But like when I had to upgrade to Rails 4, it caused like a lot of problems, because DB Charmer it's not compatible with Rails 4. And that's because like in Monkey patches, a lot of active records to actually change all that connection handler code that I show, it changed all that to make it possible. But you can also do your own solution, right? You can, like, as always, you don't have to use a gem. If it's like a specific problem that you want to solve, you can do your own thing. And that's what I'm going to show a little bit. So I'm going to show the last bullet point here, which is like how can you accomplish having multiple connections for the same model using multiple connection handlers. That's the solution we do at GitHub. So that's like I wrote that code at GitHub a few months ago. And so we used to monkey patch a lot of the connection code to make it possible. So I moved that to using multiple connection handlers. So I'm going to explain this a little bit. So just to refresh our minds, here's the diagram back. Same thing as before, right? You have like one connection handler instance, which is global. So this is how this is going to look, right? Like, so now, instead of one connection handler, I'm going to have two different connection handlers. I hope everyone can see that. So you have the default connection handler, and you have a read-only connection handler. They both have two values on that hash map, which is like base points to connection pool A and user points to connection pool B. That's on connection handler. And read-only connection handler has the same keys, but different values. So that means now that for the user case, I can point to two different connection pools. I can point to connection pool B and connection pool D. And at runtime, I can change, saying, oh, you should go to the main database, or you should use the read-only database. So this is how the code look like. Of course, this is a super simplification of it. It's just to illustrate the problem here. So you would have like a connection switcher. You have an initializer here that it creates a hash map of handlers. And the important method here is on line 6, that you have a with read-only, receives a block. And what that method does, it just swaps at runtime the default connection handler. So now you can tell, oh, you should go and use that second connection handler, which is the read-only one, and then swap it back. So to use that, you would do something like that, right? You have, that's the user model again. You still have the main established connection, which is like the default that's going to establish a user DB connection for the default handler, and you have established connection for the with read-only. And on line 8 to 10, that's how you would query a user using the with read-only database. So you just use that with read-only. That's going to swap the connection handler inline, and you can use that. OK, so that's pretty cool, right? Like, so that means like we can kind of accomplish like the second and the third use case that I told you could not do it. But like, yeah, you kind of can. But like, so what is the actual problem, right? Why do we need to do all this code around Rails just to make these use cases work? Why Rails doesn't support that for us? So like, when I was investigating this problem, I was like, the main thing that I saw was, I think, a kind of like a loop, what do you call, like a loop reference between the model and the connection handler. So if you remember that diagram that I showed before, you had like the model that calls the connection handler, and the connection handler has a bunch of pools. But the problem is like the connection handler also knows about the model. So that circular dependency, it's really bad. So that means they're really coupled together. So that's one of the reasons that you cannot use multiple connections for the same model. So if we break them, like if they are not too coupled, maybe we could accomplish what we want, right? So let me show what is next. What is next in terms of Rails 5? What is the work done in Rails 5 that changed this? So Rails 5, we decouple the model and the pool. So we pretty much like make the action, like the connection handler, not depend on the model anymore. So that means a little, like a few things, right? Like first of all, that established connection method that I showed, we eventually gonna have to kill that method because that method, if you think about it, that method was a method called in the model. If we wanna like decouple those two things, we don't wanna have like that API in the model anymore. Also, that means we're gonna have to use a new key to look up the connection pools. So we cannot use the user, like the model name anymore because again, it's gonna mean that it's too coupled and fix all the things around it. So let's take a look at the new code in Rails 5. That's the new code, that's the new established connection code. So first of all, you can see on line 1 that that code doesn't receive the class. It doesn't receive the model anymore. It only receives the configuration. And on line 6, it's pretty much, it's super close to what it was before, but if you pay close attention, you're gonna see that the key here is not the model.name anymore. It's a spec.name. And that spec.name is a thing that like the connection handler can figure it out by itself. So that spec name is pretty much, if you remember the database YAML file has always like some key and a few values, right? Like in that example in the UserDB, the main key for the UserDB database was UserDB. So that's what's gonna be the spec name. So now Rails, like for that hash map, it's gonna use those top level keys as the key to the connection pools. So how can I accomplish that data partitioning use case using Rails 5? So this is how this is gonna look. So instead of you call established connection in the model, you're gonna do that in the connection handler itself. You just call like ActiveRecord, get the connection handler, do established connection and pass the UserDB. And in the model, instead of you call established connection there, you're just gonna reference the connection that you already established before. So there is a few good things about this, right? So for instance, I don't know if you are familiar with the way that Rails live reloads code, right? So in development, when you make a change to a model, for instance, like the next time you do a request, Rails needs to live reload that. So what Rails is gonna do, it's gonna trash all your classes and it's gonna load them from file system again. So the problem before was like if you had an established connection call in the model itself, every time you would do a new request, Rails would close the connection and open a new connection again. Of course, that's just development, but still it's not ideal, right? With this new solution, now the established connection, it's not tied to the model anymore. So the model, when it gets reloaded, it doesn't have to close and open the connection anymore. Cool. So, and how about the read-only use case, right? So if this is better, how can I do that read-only use case without having to use any gem or any monkey patch? So besides that connection specification name setter that you can pass to the user, you also have a getter that you can just extend that and write your own. So if you look at this, this implementation, line 4, I'm just extending that method. And what that's going to return, it's either going to return like a read-only string or a primary string. So I can do whatever I want here, right? Like based on some runtime rules, I can just say, oh yeah, at this time the user should use the read-only connection or he should use the primary connection. So in line 13 and 14, you can see here that I'm like passing read-only mode true. So when I do in line 14 the find, that find is going to use the read-only connection. So this is kind of like how it looks like internally. Like, so the connection handler now, so we just need one connection handler. We don't need multiple connections handlers anymore. It's just going to be one, and that the hash in that connection handler is going to have primary and read-only that points to a connection pool. So there is no reference to the models anymore. You can just use and tell, oh, go and use the primary or go and use the read-only connection. So, of course, this is also backwards compatible because, I mean, we don't want to break like this, such a major thing like this in Rails releases. So you still can call established connection in the model. That will still work. But the idea is to document this better and eventually maybe in Rails 5.1 like throw a warning and maybe in Rails 5.2 remove this method altogether because ideally you should not be calling this anymore. So let me spend like, I don't know, 2 minutes talking about future work and what I want to do to make this even better in Rails 5.1. So this is a first bullet point that I'm working on right now. Actually, I have a patch for this already. I just didn't commit to Rails yet. So it's a better database YAML. So we want a better database YAML because of other things. So one of the things is like to improve the DB tasks. So I don't know if you all remember, like when you create a new Rails app in your development environment, you need to do a DB create, right? What that's going to do, it's going to go find the right database based in your environment in the database YAML, and it's going to do a create on that database. But the problem is, like, how about if you don't have one database anymore? You have 3 different databases. Like, how Rails doesn't know about those 3 databases because they're not tied to the environment. So Rails has no way to, like, create them for you. So this is my suggestion, and that's probably how the new database YAML file is going to look like in Rails 5.1. Of course, this is not final, so don't take my word for it. We could still change it. But so instead of having the database YAML file with just one level, we would have 2 levels instead. So first top level would be the Rails environment, like in this case, development. And then you would have all the database configurations, like primary, shared one, and read-only. Like that, Rails can, like in the create or in the drop tasks, Rails can just go get all the databases for development, iterate over them, and create them or drop them. There's other things we need to improve, like migrations and fixtures. So for instance, migrations, right? If you have 2 different databases, how can you apply a migration to database A and to database B? That's kind of like, it is possible right now, but there's no public API for it. So it's a little bit like hidden. So I want to make that better. So just a small summary about what my talk was about today. It's like there was, to accomplish those 3 main use cases, there was a lot of work necessary to do before Rails 5. There was a lot of groundwork put in Rails 5 to make that a little bit better. And in Rails 5.1, this work is going to be even better. Cool. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Arthur. We have time for like 2 to 3 questions. So anybody has?
Oh, by the way, I have a lot of GitHub stickers if anyone wants stickers afterwards.
So it looks like no question.